Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 7th chapter in the 2nd book of Samuel. Here we read of the Davidic covenant, or the initiation of, and there's also a parallel account in 1 Chronicles 17, but there's a little more information in this account. But before we delve on that, we just want to define our terms. Covenant would have been a term that was familiar in the ancient Near East diplomatic lexicon, which described the arrangements of coexistence between a stronger party and a weaker party. So an example, if there was a militarily weaker state, the stronger party might initiate a covenant among them whereby they agreed to not swallow them whole, not only to not swallow them whole, but to protect them for money in exchange for X amount of tribute. But what's distinct about the covenants that exist between Yahweh and man is that they exist between divinity. They're not geopolitical entities. It's altogether different sovereignty and superiority of power. He is the stronger party by any means or measure, and because it belongs, the covenant comes from the one from whom it is sent. It is connected to his unchangeable nature, so he cannot dishonor his violation. He cannot violate his terms of the covenant. We, however, can. And this is the 5th such covenant of which we read of in the Old Testament, the original one of which was given to Noah, whereby God just promised him that he would never destroy the earth again by flood, and illustrated the promise through the symbolism of the rainbow. Of course, the world will be consumed by fire at the moment. The day of history, which marks the consummation of human history, and the righteous remnant will be raptured, but the wicked majority will be left to burn in the fires of the earth and ultimately in the fires of hell. But the second such covenant we read is issued to Abram, as he was then known, and he promised him to be a global blessing and to make his family, his son, into a nation and a people through whom the whole world would be blessed. Then the third one of which we read is between the nation of Israel, through given by Yahweh through Moses to the nation of Israel on Mount Sinai. This marks the beginning of the law, which was to govern how they were to, their entire reason for existing and purpose as a nation was to give the nations a witness of Yahweh's character. And then we also read of the covenant between Phinehas. He is the son of Aaron, and his a priestly dynasty in perpetuity. The high priest office was hereditary, or at least that's the way it began. And here in the Davidic covenant, we read of a royal promise of perpetuity given to David. But as we read, the offering of this covenant comes in response to an offering of David to his, which is rejected for reasons which we will soon discuss. Just not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we will say that the offering that he makes him is to build him his temple, because as we read in the opening verse, he was at rest from his enemies by this time. So much of what anticipates this chapter in the preceding ones in 2 Samuel, David, the book of 2 Samuel begins when Saul is dead and David is alive, but his path to the palace is not paved without struggles. There are internal enemies and external enemies abroad, so he was constantly fighting to hold his rather tenuous position, but he kind of solidifies his hold on power and grip around his enemies by the 5th chapter. And in the 6th chapter we read that he moves the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, where it would have been safe, and he's dancing in the street and joy for this occasion, and this provokes the wrath and ire of his wife Mishael, who is the daughter of Saul, so given to him in exchange for his killing of some 200 Philistines, which connected him to the preceding dynasty. So there was a continuity of sorts. Even though Jonathan and all of Saul's sons died, his daughter remained, and David was married to her, but she lets him have it. And but other than things in the home, things are well in Judah and in Israel. And so the opening verse reads, "And it came to be when the king was dwelling in his house, and Yahweh had given him rest from all the enemies abroad." Now the word house is going to appear 15 times in the chapter we're about to read. It's either in reference to the palace where David lived, or the temple, which was to be the house of Yahweh, or it's also to the house as in the dynasty which rules. So there's we do read that 15 times, but he had given him rest from all his enemies around, so that Israel was beset by enemies, and the entire reason they entered into a monarchical form of government was there was no stability in the period of Judges, during which time they were switched and swapped by a series of foreign oppressors. But at this glorious moment in time, he has rest, his borders are secure, his position is stable in the geopolitical chessboard. And that the sovereign said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I am dwelling in a house of cedar, but the ark of Elohim dwells within curtains." Nathan is the prophet of the king. This is the first mention, first of 3 times. The other one is when he's rebuked for his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, and also he plays an instrumental role in sealing the transition of the throne to Solomon from David at his request. But his prophet during the exile would have been Gad, but Gad still remains. He's mentioned as late as the 24th chapter of this book. But kings were always, there was always at least one prophet while there was a king, and the king is telling the king is telling his prophet that he is dwelling in a house of cedar. This would have been a luxurious palace. Cedar would have came from Lebanon or Phoenicia, the nation to the north, but the ark of Elohim, which he had just moved into Jerusalem, dwells within curtains. This would have been the tabernacle, which was the temple's predecessor as the divine home, or certainly he is omnipresent, he is everywhere at once, but it was considered his dwelling place on earth, where his presence was most infinite for the covenant nation. And Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that is in your heart, for Yahweh is with you." So Nathan, he's not consulted by Yahweh. He doesn't consult him, and it's not until Yahweh consults him that Nathan actually responds with the word that comes from him, because that's what prophets did. He's speaking on his own accord here. He knows that David is a man after Yahweh's own heart. So do what's in your heart, because you have a heart inclined towards Yahweh, and Yahweh is with you. But then we read in the 4th verse, "And it came to be that night that the word of Yahweh came to Nathan, saying," 5th verse, "Go and say to my servant David, Thus said Yahweh, would you build a house for me to dwell in?" So he's posing it in a form of the question, and he's ultimately going to answer it as we read. So the 6th verse reads, "For I have not dwelt in a house since the time that I brought the children of Israel up from Egypt, even to this day, but have moved about in a tent and in a dwelling place." So during the Exodus, that's when the instructions came that they were to house this tabernacle, which is to be the site and center of their worship and their divine presence on earth, which was to accompany them everywhere they went in the desert. So they were not a stationary people when the tabernacle was introduced as the site and center of the divine presence on earth. And they would have been a mobile people constantly on the move, so it was in a tent, because tents are portable, houses or permanent building structures are not. And so it had been up to this time, all the way to the Exodus, they had become a stationary people, and the tent became somewhat stationary. It hopped around from place to place, and from there, this location to that location. But it would have been fitting and appropriate, David feels at this point, but remember it's Yahweh speaking, for him to have a house to call his own. "Wherever I have walked with all the children of Israel, have I ever spoken a word to anyone from the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, Israel, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar?" So Yahweh, being omnipresent, is indifferent to he had instructed the people to build a tent. This was in their ceremonies, but what David is realizing is that he's at peace. He has the luxury and the time to build a stationary location to Yahweh. So this is something that Yahweh had never asked, never demanded, never introduced or imposed the question on anyone else. So David is the one who is. It's his idea, essentially, he's saying, because he's indifferent and he's content to remain as he is. And now say to my servant David, thus said Yahweh of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the flock, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. This is a reminder of David's origin. He was a shepherd to begin with. He was a shepherd boy, the youngest of 8 children, from an obscure village of Bethlehem, the son of Jesse, an obscure man of ordinary means. But he was elevated through the path of struggle to be the ruler and the shepherd of his people, Israel. It was all by Yahweh's grace and Yahweh's power, but that is not to suggest that Yahweh did not put him through the fire and the ringer en route thereto. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and have made you a great name, like the name of the great ones who are on the earth. So he's always been present with him, even when he was on the run and on the exile and fleeing for his very life. He triumphed over his would-be captors, and now that he's king, he's triumphing over the surrounding enemies which seek to harm Israel, and he has made his name great. He is famous because he abides in the one whose office it is to bestow fame on others. And I shall appoint a place for my people Israel, and shall plant them, and they shall dwell in the place of their own, and no longer be afraid. Neither shall the children of wickedness oppress them again, as at the first. So during their period of judges, when they did not have a monarchy like the surrounding nations, they had a less efficient form of government in judges. There was no continuity from judge to the next. They kind of rose as an emergency crutch when the oppression of the foreign invaders got too overwhelming. So finally the people cried out mightily to Yahweh in unison, and he sent them a judge and a deliverer. But that's not something they have to worry about as long as they have a David or a Solomon on the throne. Their territory will be protected. They will be safe from harm. And the ancient fears would be unknown to those who lived under David and Solomon's rule, respectively. Even from the day I appointed rulers over my people Israel, and have caused you to rest from all your enemies, and Yahweh has declared to you that he would make you a house. So even though he's offering to build him a house, he's offering him something unimaginably greater to David, the one who offers to make him a house. He's offering him an eternal dynasty through the birth of his Messiah. That is not to be mistaken for his earthly dynasty, which sat on the throne of Jerusalem at least until 586 BM, before Messiah, when Zedekiah, the last of the Davidic line, was discarded, and I think he had his eyes gouged out. When your days are filled, and you rest with your fathers, I shall rise up your seed after you, who comes from your inward parts, and shall establish his kingdom. Now the who is both immediate and future, or anticipation of the future. This can be interpreted in one and two ways, and neither of them are incorrect. Solomon, his son, and his successor as the throne, he would, and also his more distant descendant, Yahshua Messiah, who would come about millennia hence, 1,000 years later, when his dynasty was no longer firmly seated on the throne of Jerusalem, but a boy who would have been on the throne, whose father would have been on the throne had the dynasty continued, but his humble carpenter is the other interpretation. So what we read, we're going to try to interpret in both lenses and in both lights. He builds a house for my name, and I shall establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The house would have been the temple. That was something he left to Solomon, because, long story short, David was a man of war who had blood on his hands, where Solomon had the luxury, because of David's military activity, to be a man of peace and diplomacy and commerce. So he would have been the one to build the house, but the house is also the temple, which was referenced by the Savior as his own body. And he is the one whose throne will rule forever. He has no descendants. He is eternal and eternally existent, and he's the Messiah who's going to be. His kingdom is going to be of a different nature than the earthly one. We just want to bear that in mind as we continue. I am to be his father, and he is my son. If he does perversely, I shall reprove him with the rod of men, and with the blows of the Son of Men. So even though all children of Elohim, all humanity, are in some sense his son, this is, if it were a reference to the Messiah, it would have been a capital S, but he is the only begotten. But the rulers of his chosen people, Israel, are likened to a son. And if they get out of line, if they violate the terms or their end of upholding the covenant, he's going to discipline them with the rod of men. So he's going to use external human agents as his instrument to express his divine displeasure. And with the blows of Son of Men, Israel would ultimately be overwhelmed by the blows, or Judah by Babylon. But my kindness does not turn aside from him, as I turned it aside from Saul, whom I removed before you. So he will have mercy on those, and he will condemn those who he likes and as he sees fit. Saul, for a variety of reasons, was not worthy of his mercy because he was an unworthy man who was morally mediocre at best, and he outright deteriorated. So he was displaced from having his seed or his lineage rule, but David is promised an eternal rule. So not only is Saul's dynasty, strictly speaking, lasted with him, but we already explained the connection through which David was a family by marriage of Saul. But the ones who came from his seed and his soil would last forever. They would be without limit and without end, and that is his rule, the nature thereof. And your house and your kingdom are to be steadfast forever before you. Your throne is established forever. So he's promising him a permanent dynasty and in perpetuity. So this kingdom is not going to be the kingdom that's seated on the throne. He's promising him the Messiah. This is another Old Testament allusion to the Messiah to come, and recommended side reading of this are psalms such as the 89th one, which speak of it. Now the word covenant, I don't believe, is mentioned in any of these verses or in this passage, but that explains what just transpired of what we just read and commented on in covenantal terms. And the 17th verse reads, according to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So Nathan was approached. He didn't approach Yahweh, but Yahweh approached him with the word and the correct counsel. So Nathan had earlier sent David, entrusting him implicitly to that what he would do would have the blessing of Yahweh. But what does Yahweh do but interrupt and tell him that he has different plans. He has greater plans in storage. You're not going to be the one to build it because, well, as it explains elsewhere in Scripture, that he has too much blood on his hand. Being a warrior, he wanted someone whose reign was devoted to peace to be the one to build the temple for him. So that would be fulfilled more immediately, and the promise would not manifest, the ultimate promise of what he had to offer. So what he had to offer Yahweh would be completed and fulfilled, and he certainly made much of the arrangements to make it all happen and possible. But the one to actually build it would be Solomon, but the one who the promise that Yahweh offered him, which supersedes, so Nathan gives David good news and bad news. The bad news is that he will not be the one to build his temple. The good news is that Yahweh is offering something to him which is unimaginably beyond measure in value. And we don't have enough time to comment on the remainder of the chapter. So in response to this news, we read of David's prayer. I'm just going to read it in its entirety from chapters verses 18 through 29. This is the close of the chapter. We get a glimpse of the gratitude that is in his heart in the moment in time. And if there's enough time left over, I'll comment on some things or something which popped out to me. So the 18th verse reads, "And King David went in and sat before Yahweh, and he said, Who am I, O Master Yahweh, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? And yet this was a small matter in your eyes, O Master Yahweh, and you have also spoken of your servant's house for a great while to come. And is this the teaching of man, O Master Yahweh? And what more does David say to you? For you, Master Yahweh, know your servant. Because of your word, and according to your own heart, you have done all this greatness to make it known to your servant. You are great indeed, O Master Yahweh, for there is none like you, and there is no Elohim but you, according to all that we have heard with our ears. And who is like your people, like Israel, the one nation on the earth, whom Elohim went to redeem for himself as a people, to make for himself a name, and to do for your greatness and awesome deeds for your land before your people, whom you redeemed for yourself from Egypt, from the nations and their mighty ones. And you have established for yourself your people, Israel, as your own people forever, and you, Yahweh, have become their Elohim. And now, O Yahweh Elohim, the word which you have spoken concerning your servant and concerning his house, established it forever, as you have said. And let your name be made great forever, saying, Yahweh of hosts is the Elohim over Israel. And let the house of your servant David be established before you. For you, O Yahweh of hosts, the Elohim of Israel, have revealed this to be your servant, saying, I build you a house. Therefore your servant has taken heart to pray to you. And now, O Master Yahweh, you are Elohim, and your words are true, and you have spoken this goodness in your heart. And now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, to be before you forever. For you, O Master Yahweh, have spoken it, and with your blessing let the house of your servant be blessed forever. So we're just going to break it down from the top. David approaches it from the attitude of abject humility. He acknowledges that he was not born great. He had been made great through the power and the grace and the providence of Yahweh. And this is just a small thing before his eyes, but he's mindful of how big it is for him to be promised of him. And he acknowledges the greatness which made it all possible and the knowledge which he bestows upon his servant. And he just continues with kind of this expression of greatness. Greatness is one of his attributes. It is one of those words that falls far short of his actual grandeur and scope, but greatness is fitting nonetheless. And what's interesting in the 23rd verse is he says, to make himself a name. So Yahweh promises to make David's name great, but Yahweh's promise to make his people is people great. Israel is connected to their promise to make his name great, to be a living witness and testimony to the nations all around them. And he just acknowledges the unique station of Israel as his chosen people. They are selected for a divine purpose, and as their king, he especially embodies that purpose. And so he accepts without complaint or protest or objection the fact that he had rejected his offer, because he lays hold of the offer which is before him, that is offered to him, which is exponentially greater than anything he could even think to offer Yahweh. And he being a man of prayer and after Yahweh's own heart, he responds to this news in prayer and makes his expression known, and they are praiseworthy and positive. And he closes with an acknowledgement that he is Elohim, his word is true, and that what he has spoken is good. So he accepts and he delights in what he has spoken to him through Nathan. And he just closes with the full and final farewell, just to continue to bless and bless your servant and you to be blessed forever. So he's mindful of the scope, the eternality of the scope, which this blessing has promised, and it comes from the one who is eternally blessed and can bless others eternally. So I hope that's the reason you're here, and that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.